The photo came to me at 2 a.m. No sender name, no message, just a photo. And in that photo, Yoon Jae-hyun, the man Seoul calls untouchable, the man whose name makes prosecutors go quiet and witnesses go missing, standing outside a clinic in Incheon, in a hoodie like he thought nobody was watching, with his hand on the back of a woman, a pregnant woman, a woman who was not his wife. I zoomed in. I looked at her face. I looked at that belly. Twins, the shape said. Definitely twins. And I thought, this man is currently in divorce court, fighting his wife for custody of their image, their assets, their dynasty. So who is this woman? Because whatever secret Yoon Jae-hyun has been hiding inside that pregnancy, somebody just decided the world needed to know. The question is, why now? Let me set the scene for you. Yoon Jae-hyun, 41 years old, Busan-born, Seoul-made. His legitimate businesses cover real estate, private logistics, and a luxury hotel chain with locations in 4 countries. His illegitimate business? Nobody says it out loud, but everybody knows. You don't become that rich, that fast, that protected, without a shadow operation running underneath. His divorce from Seo Yoona, his wife of 9 years, daughter of a former government minister, has been Seoul's favorite ongoing drama for 8 months. Leaked documents, dueling press releases from competing law firms, a war of silence played out in the financial pages. The official story from Yoon's camp, irreconcilable differences. Mutual decision, civilized. The real story, according to my sources, Seo Yoona discovered something in his private accounts, something that didn't add up. And when she asked questions, 3 of her personal staff were quietly let go within the week. That's the man. That's the situation. Now enter Zuri. My source, who I will never name, not for any amount of money, told me that Zuri had been in Seoul since arriving on an architecture residency 3 years prior. Legitimate visa, legitimate work. She'd designed 2 award-nominated commercial spaces in Mapo district. Quiet life, small social circle, 0 connection to the criminal world. Publicly. The clinic in the photo is a prenatal specialist, high-end, private, the kind of place politicians and executives use specifically because they have a reputation for absolute discretion. Cameras aren't supposed to exist within 200 meters of that building, and yet, the photo existed. I spent 48 hours verifying it. I sent it to 2 independent image analysts. I called a contact inside Incheon's medical licensing board. No denial came back. The image was real. The date stamp was real. And Zuri, 7 months pregnant, clearly exhausted, clearly trying to stay small in a big coat, was real. The problem was, by the time I had confirmation, Zuri was already gone. No forwarding address, no goodbye posts. Her apartment in Mapo cleared out in under a night. Her architecture firm listed her as on extended personal leave. She had disappeared from Seoul like she'd never existed. And Yoon Jae-hyun? He walked into divorce court the next morning looking like nothing in the world could touch him. That is when I knew this wasn't just a scandal. This was a cover-up. Active, organized, and running on a clock I couldn't see. But here's the thing about cover-ups. They always leave one thread. And the thread Yoon Jae-hyun's team left behind? They left it at an airport. And what was caught on that camera is going to make your jaw drop. Every disappearance has a paper trail. Every paper trail has a crack. And cracks, that's where I live. My contact at Incheon Airport, and before you ask, no, I won't be sharing that name either, flagged something 3 days after Zuri vanished from Seoul. A woman matching Zuri's description had passed through Terminal 2 at 4:17 in the morning. Private check-in lane. The kind that costs extra specifically so your name doesn't appear on standard departure boards. But here is where Yoon Jae-hyun's team made their mistake. She wasn't traveling alone. There were 2 men with her. Not family, not friends. The body language was all wrong. Too close, too deliberate, one on each side of her. The kind of positioning that isn't protection. It's management. My source pulled the associated travel documentation. The 2 men were listed as employees of a private security firm, a firm that, when I traced its registration, led me back through 3 shell companies to a logistics holding group. A logistics holding group that appeared in Yoon Jae-hyun's publicly declared business portfolio. So let me be clear about what I'm telling you. The most feared mafia boss in South Korea, who is currently fighting a divorce case that hinges entirely on his finances and his character, had his own private security operatives escort his pregnant girlfriend out of the country, in secret, before dawn. This was not Zuri running. This was Zuri being moved. The destination on the paperwork, Lisbon, Portugal, one way. I booked my flight 4 hours later. Now, I have to be careful here, because what I found in Lisbon is where this story stops being about a hidden pregnancy and starts being about something much larger. When I arrived and started asking quiet questions in the right neighborhoods, a source led me to a safe house location in Belém, a quiet district, close to the river, the kind of area where nothing looks suspicious because everything is old and still. I knocked on the door, and Zuri opened it. She looked at me, this stranger on her doorstep, and instead of slamming the door, she just said, "I knew someone would come. I just didn't know if it would be a journalist or one of his people." She let me in, and on the kitchen table, I saw it immediately, a manila envelope, slightly open. The header on the first page read, "Independent Genetic Analysis, Confidential." She saw me see it, and she said, "That's why I ran. That's why they let me run, because they think I don't understand what it says." I sat down, and she started talking. What Zuri told me in that kitchen in Lisbon. I've been reporting for 11 years, and I have never sat across from a source and felt the story physically change shape in front of me. Because the secret she was hiding wasn't just about those twins, it was about who ordered that DNA test. And when I heard the answer, I understood why she was terrified. I need you to understand something about Zuri before I tell you what she said. This was not a naive woman. This was not someone who got swept up in something she didn't see coming. Zuri held 2 architecture degrees. She spoke 4 languages. She had built a life in Seoul deliberately, carefully, on her own terms. She had not fallen into Yoon Jae-hyun's world by accident. She told me they'd met through a mutual contact in the design industry, a commissioning introduction for one of his hotel renovation projects. Professional at first, then personal. Then, over 2 years, something she described as genuinely real, private, away from his other life. "He kept me separate," she said. "I thought that was protection. Later I understood it was compartmentalization. The pregnancy wasn't planned, but when it happened, twins." Yoon Jae-hyun's reaction was not what she expected. He didn't pull back. He became more involved, more present. He talked about the children with a specific kind of intensity she hadn't seen in him before. "He wanted them," she said. "That part was real. I believe that part." But then the divorce proceedings with Seo Yuna entered a new phase, a phase where his wife's legal team began subpoenaing financial records. And something shifted. Yoon Jae-hyun grew distant. Meetings were rescheduled. Calls went to voicemail. And then, about 6 weeks before the airport disappearance, someone came to Zuri's apartment. Not Yoon Jae-hyun, but a man she'd seen once before at his office, and delivered a request, a DNA test, pre-birth, the private kind. "His lawyers sent him," Zuri said quietly. "They told me it was routine, standard for the children's documentation." But Zuri was not naive. She submitted to the test, but she kept a copy of the results for herself. And when those results came back, she read them carefully, and then she read them again. And she called a genetics consultant she found independently, someone with no connection to Yoon Jae-hyun, and she asked one question. I asked her what the results showed. She was quiet for a long time. Then she pushed the manila envelope across the table toward me. I opened it, and I read it. And I understood, in that moment, why his lawyers had ordered it. Not to confirm paternity. That wasn't the purpose at all. The purpose was to confirm something else. Something that, if it became public during divorce proceedings, would completely restructure the legal and financial terrain of Yoon Jae-hyun's case. I also understood why Zuri hadn't run from him. She had run from his lawyers, because those lawyers did not want this document to exist outside of their control. And Zuri, sitting in Lisbon, 8 months pregnant and completely alone, was the only person alive who had an uncontrolled copy. "They think I'm just protecting myself," she said. "They think I'm scared." She looked at me directly. "But I'm not scared for me. I'm scared for my daughters. Because if his legal team gets this back, if they bury it, those girls will never have a fair claim to anything. They will be invisible. By design." I asked her if she was willing to go on record. She said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask me that." Zuri was ready to talk. The document was in my hands, and I thought, the hardest part is over. But then my phone rang. Unknown number, Seoul area code, and the voice on the other end said 5 words that made me realize the story wasn't just being followed, it was being hunted. 5 words. That's all it took. We know where you are. I stood in Zuri's kitchen in Lisbon, the manila envelope still warm in my hands, the sound of the river faintly audible through the window. And I felt the temperature of the entire story drop about 10 degrees. The voice was calm, male. No accent I could place immediately, but the Seoul area code was right there on my screen, glowing like a warning signal I should have anticipated, but didn't. Because I'd been so focused on getting to Zuri that I hadn't fully calculated the risk of what happened after I got there. I hung up. I looked at Zuri. She read my face before I said a word. "How long do we have?" she asked, completely steady. No panic. Like she'd been preparing for this exact moment since the day she landed in Lisbon. That composure, I'll be honest with you, scared me more than the phone call, because it meant she already knew. She'd known this was coming. She had been living inside this threat for weeks, alone, and she had not broken. She had simply waited. For someone like me to arrive. For the story to have a witness. I told her we needed to move. Not immediately. A sudden departure would be visible, trackable. But within the hour. While she packed, and I want to note that what she packed fit into one bag, which told me everything about how long she'd been ready to leave at a moment's notice, I stepped outside and made 3 calls. The first call was to my editor. I told her we had a live story, a willing source, and an active intimidation situation. I told her to start the legal documentation process and that I'd be sending encrypted files within 24 hours. The second call was to a press freedom legal contact I've used twice before in situations that went sideways. I gave her Zuri's name, location, and a summary of the threat. She told me to get to a public place with witnesses and stay there. The third call, this one I debated, but I made it. I called a contact inside the Seoul Economic Crimes Division, not to report anything officially, just to say a name, Yoon Jae-hyun, and to say, something is coming, you might want to be ready. He didn't respond. But he didn't hang up either. We left the safe house at just past noon. Zuri moved slowly, 8 months pregnant, carrying one bag, wearing dark glasses that were more practical than fashionable. We took a tram to the Baiha district, found a busy cafe with outdoor seating on a crowded pedestrian street, and I set up my recorder. Because if they were already watching and I had to assume they were, then the safest thing Zuri could do was become public, visible, on record, in the open. The story being out there was the protection. A source nobody knows about can be silenced. A source who has already spoken to a journalist with documentation, that's a much more complicated problem to manage. I ordered us both coffee. She ordered tea, looked at me, and said, "Ask me anything." So I asked her about the lawyers. And this is where the story became something I wasn't entirely prepared for. The legal team representing Yoon Jae-hyun in his divorce proceedings, a firm I will not name directly for ongoing legal reasons, but which my publication's lawyers have fully documented, had been building a very specific defense strategy. The strategy centered on the claim that Yoon Jae-hyun's personal wealth was not derived from criminal enterprise, but from legitimate inheritance and business development. That his fortune, in short, was clean. For this strategy to hold, certain connections could not come to light. Certain relationships could not be documented. Certain heirs could not be formally acknowledged, because formal acknowledgement meant financial documentation, and financial documentation meant a thread his wife's legal team could pull. The DNA test wasn't about confirming Yoon Jae-hyun was the father of Zuri's twins. The DNA test was about confirming something additional, a familial link that, if acknowledged in legal proceedings, would force a complete restructuring of his declared assets. A link that connected the twins not just to Yoon Jae-hyun personally, but to a specific inheritance structure his lawyers had spent 2 years carefully obscuring. I asked Zuri how she had figured this out. She said, because the genetics consultant I called, the independent one, told me that the test didn't just sequence for paternity markers. It sequenced for a much wider familial panel. That's not standard. That's not what you do when you just want to confirm a father. That's what you do when you need to confirm or deny a bloodline for legal purposes. She paused, took a sip of tea. They weren't testing if he was the father. They already knew that. They were testing whether my daughters carried a genetic marker that would prove a direct line to his grandfather's estate. An estate that is currently the subject of a separate private inheritance dispute. One that has never been made public. One that involves a sum of money that would make the divorce settlement look like loose change. I put down my pen. I looked at her. "And do they carry it?" I asked. She reached into her bag, pulled out the envelope, slid it across the cafe table, in the middle of a crowded Lisbon street, in broad afternoon light. "Read the last page," she said. I read the last page. The genetic marker was confirmed. Present in both fetuses, clearly documented, undeniable. Zuri's unborn daughters were not just the children of a mafia boss managing a messy divorce. They were the biological heirs to one of the largest undocumented private fortunes in South Korean criminal history. And Yoon Jae-hyun's own lawyers had run the test, and then tried to make both the results and the mother disappear. I sat back in my chair.
안녕, 여러분. Before you continue, if this story touched something in you, you should know I didn't tell everything yet. The complete version has 20 full audio episodes. No interruptions, no ads. Just the story, the emotions, and the moments I couldn't fit in here. If you scan the QR code on your screen, or tap the link in the pinned comment, to continue listening right now.
Around us, tourists were taking photos of the street. A busker somewhere nearby was playing something slow in Spanish. The afternoon was completely ordinary, and I was sitting across from a woman who was carrying, inside her body, the two most legally significant unborn children in South Korea. My phone buzzed, text message, unknown number, no words, just a photo of me. Taken from a distance. Sitting at this exact cafe table. Taken within the last 10 minutes. They weren't in Seoul. They were already in Lisbon. I had the document, I had the source, I had the story fully confirmed. But Yoon Jae-hyun's people were 30 seconds behind us in a foreign city. And what they were about to reveal in that divorce courtroom back in Seoul. Nobody saw it coming. Not his wife, not his lawyers, and definitely not him. Here is something they don't tell you in journalism school. There is a specific kind of moment, rare, violent in its clarity, when a story you thought you understood suddenly reveals a completely different architecture underneath. Like you've been looking at the front of a building your whole life and someone finally walks you around to the back and you realize the entire structure is something else. Something you wouldn't have believed if you hadn't seen it yourself. That moment happened to me in Lisbon. And then it happened again. Louder, more publicly, more catastrophically for everyone involved. 3 days later in a courtroom in Seoul. Let me take you there. After the photo text, Zuri and I made a fast decision. We didn't run. Running was what they expected. Instead, we went in the opposite direction. I contacted the most prominent international press freedom organization with an active Lisbon bureau, and we walked into their offices that afternoon with the document, a recorded testimony from Zuri, and a formal witness protection request. Within 6 hours, Zuri was in a secure accommodation coordinated through the organization's legal partners. She was no longer alone. She was no longer invisible. She was now a formally documented international press source, and any action taken against her would immediately become an international press freedom incident. Yoon Jae-hyun's people pulled back. Not because they'd given up, because they were smart enough to know that making a move against a visibly protected pregnant woman in a foreign country, with an international press organization already holding documentation, was a different kind of problem than quietly moving her out of Seoul at 4 a.m. They pulled back, and they went back to Seoul. I filed the story, encrypted, legally reviewed, time-stamped, with my publication. It went to our senior editor and 2 legal reviewers simultaneously. Publication was scheduled for 72 hours later, with full documentation attached. But something happened before we published. Something that none of us, not me, not my editor, not Zuri, and certainly not Yoon Jae-hyun, had anticipated. His wife's legal team found the thread. Not from my article, that hadn't published yet. Not from Zuri. She was sealed and silent. But from somewhere inside Yoon Jae-hyun's own legal team. A paralegal, I later learned. Someone who had worked on the DNA test documentation and who had been quietly and privately appalled by what they'd been asked to participate in. Someone who had their own copy of certain internal communications. Someone who walked into the Seoul family court on a Tuesday morning and handed a sealed envelope to the presiding judge. I found out because my contact inside the Economic Crimes Division sent me one text: "Turn on the court feed." I turned on the court feed, and what I watched, from a cafe in Lisbon, 8 hours behind Seoul with a cold coffee going cold in front of me, was Yoon Jae-hyun's divorce proceeding detonate in real time. His lead attorney was mid-sentence when the judge called a recess. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When court resumed, the judge's entire demeanor had shifted. A new document had been entered into the record. Yoon Jae-hyun's legal team immediately requested an emergency adjournment. It was denied. The document was read into the record. I won't walk you through the full legal language, but the substance was this. The court was informed that the petitioner, Yoon Jae-hyun, had commissioned a private genetic analysis of 2 unborn children during active divorce proceedings. That the purpose of said analysis was to assess the children's eligibility as heirs to a separate undisclosed inheritance structure. And that steps had been taken, documented steps, to relocate the mother of said children outside of South Korean jurisdiction without her informed legal consent. The courtroom, I could see it on the feed, went completely, absolutely still. Seo Yoona, his wife, turned to look at Yoon Jae-hyun with the specific expression of a woman who has suspected something enormous for a very long time and has just been handed the confirmation. Yoon Jae-hyun stared straight ahead. His lead attorney leaned over and said something close to his ear. Yoon Jae-hyun did not respond. And then, and this is the moment I will remember for the rest of my career, his second attorney, the younger one, stood up. And in a quiet, controlled voice, she said 4 words to the court that changed everything. "My client has comments." The room shifted again. Because this was not scheduled, this was not prepared. This was a man who had spent 8 months saying absolutely nothing in that courtroom, managing everything through counsel, through statements, through the careful machinery of elite legal representation, suddenly deciding in this moment to speak. Yoon Jae-hyun stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the judge. And then, briefly, unmistakably, he looked directly at the camera covering the proceedings for the court record. Like he knew I was watching. Like he knew someone was watching. Like he had made a calculation in real time about what the next 30 seconds needed to contain. And he said, "I am paraphrasing only because the official transcript is still sealed, but my source was in that room." He said, "The children exist. They are mine. And their rights will not be negotiated as part of these proceedings or any other. I am prepared to acknowledge them fully and formally, immediately." His wife's attorney dropped her pen. His own attorney sat back down very slowly, like someone whose chair had been pulled out from under them by someone they trusted. The judge called a full recess. My phone rang. It was my editor. She said, "Our article is already partially obsolete. He just went ahead of us." I said, "No, he didn't go ahead of us. He reacted to us. There's a difference." Because here's what the courtroom moment didn't contain. Here's what Yoon Jae-hyun's public acknowledgement of his daughters, dramatic as it was, unexpected as it was, deliberately, carefully left out. It said nothing about the inheritance structure, nothing about the undisclosed estate, nothing about why the DNA test had been ordered, nothing about Zuri being moved to Lisbon by his own security operatives. He had acknowledged the children. He had said nothing about the money. And the money, the real story, the story underneath the story, was still entirely in play. We published at 6 a.m. Seoul time the next morning. Full documentation, Zuri's testimony, the genetic analysis summary, the shell company trail, all of it. By 9 a.m., 3 major Korean news organizations had picked it up. By noon, it was international. By 3 p.m., Yoon Jae-hyun's stock-listed holding company had suspended trading pending a regulatory review. And by evening, just before I boarded a flight back to Seoul because I needed to be there for what came next, I received a message from a number I didn't recognize. No name, no greeting, just a single sentence. "She should have stayed hidden. Now everyone is watching. You've made this more dangerous, not less." I read it twice. And then I wrote back. That was always the point. I landed in Seoul at dawn. The city was awake and burning with this story. And waiting for me, in a conference room I did not expect, with people I did not expect to see in the same room, was the moment where every single piece of this finally locked into place, and where Yoon Jae-hyun made the one move nobody predicted. Seoul at dawn, when you're landing with a story this size, Feels like the city already knows. I don't know how to explain that feeling exactly, but the air has a different weight. The cab from the airport is too quiet. Your phone keeps lighting up with names you haven't spoken to in months. Journalists, legal contacts, fixers, people who want to know which direction the story is moving before they decide which side to be visible on. I checked into my hotel, showered, changed, and walked into the most unusual meeting of my professional life by 8 a.m. My editor had arranged it. She'd been busy while I was in the air. In the conference room of our publication's Seoul bureau, our legal team, the Press Freedom Organization's Korea liaison, a representative from the Seoul Family Court Oversight Committee who was there in a personal, not official capacity, and a lawyer I didn't recognize. The lawyer I didn't recognize introduced herself as Yoon Jae-hyun's new lead attorney, not the firm that had been representing him for the last 8 months. A new one, brought in overnight. She sat across from me with the composure of someone who had been handed a fire to manage and had decided the only viable approach was to negotiate rather than fight. She said, "My client is not here to threaten or obstruct. He is here, through me, to make a proposal." I looked at my editor. My editor looked at me. "I'm listening," I said. "Here is what was proposed in summary. And I want to be precise, because what happened in that room is, I believe, genuinely without precedent in any case I've covered." Yoon Jae-hyun was prepared to formally acknowledge his daughters, both of them, in legal documentation, effective immediately, with their names to be chosen by Zuri without any conditions or negotiations. He was prepared to establish a formal legal trust in both children's names, funded at a level that would make their financial security absolute for life, structured under Portuguese law where they currently resided, with international legal oversight. He was prepared to formally withdraw any asset claims related to the undisclosed inheritance from the divorce proceedings, effectively conceding that portion of the case, and to allow the inheritance structure to be reviewed by an independent financial auditor agreed upon by all parties. And he was prepared, and this was the part that made the room go quiet, to provide a full written statement to the court acknowledging that the decision to commission the DNA test and relocate Zuri had been made under legal advice he now formally rejected, and that the operatives involved had acted without Zuri's fully informed consent. He was not admitting criminal liability. His new lawyers had clearly threaded that needle carefully. But he was, in a manner that left very little room for interpretation, acknowledging that what had been done to Zuri was wrong. I asked one question. "Does Zuri know about this proposal?" The lawyer said, "Not yet. We came to you first because it was your publication that made this public. We believed that was appropriate." I called Zuri immediately. Secure line. She was in Lisbon, 38 weeks pregnant, sitting with the Press Freedom Organization's legal support team who had been with her since I left. I told her what was on the table. The line was silent for almost 30 seconds. Then she said, "The names are mine to choose. He doesn't touch that." I told her, "Confirmed. Already in the proposal. Unconditionally." Another silence. "And the auditor for the inheritance? It's independent? Truly independent?" I looked at the lawyer across the table. The lawyer nodded. "Yes," I said. Zuri took a breath. "Then I want it in writing. Signed. Before I agree to anything. And I want my own lawyer. Not one he pays for. Not one connected to anything in his world. To review every line." That process took 11 days. I stayed in Seoul. I covered the parallel collapse of Yoon Jae-hyun's original legal team. 2 of the 3 senior partners quietly stepped back from the firm within the week, citing personal reasons, which is the kind of thing that happens when you realize your professional decisions have become part of a public legal record. The divorce proceedings were formally suspended, pending the new financial review. SEO Yuna's legal team, to their credit,
If you made it to the end, you already understand this isn't just another story. What you watched here is only a fragment. The full experience lives in 20 complete audio episodes, carefully told, with every detail, every emotion, every turning point. There are no ads, no interruptions, and nothing was removed like it is on YouTube. You can listen anytime on your phone with total privacy, inside the members-only area. Scan the QR code on your screen now, or tap the link in the pinned comment.
Issued a statement saying they supported the financial audit and would be cooperating, which was legally clever and, I suspect, personally satisfying. Yoon Jae-hyun himself said nothing publicly, nothing at all. Not one statement, not one appearance. He went into a silence so complete it became its own kind of statement. On the 12th day, Zuri signed. On the 14th day, her daughters were born in a private hospital in Lisbon. Both healthy, both loud. I was told this by the Press Freedom Organization's liaison who was present. She described the sound as decisive. I love that word for it. Zuri named them. I won't share the names here. That is hers to share, on her own terms, in her own time. But I will tell you that she sent me a photo the morning after they were born. No message, just the photo. 2 tiny faces, dark, perfect, absolutely unimpressed with the world they'd just entered. I looked at that photo for a long time. I thought about the document on the kitchen table in Lisbon, the manila envelope, the test that was supposed to disappear them, the pre-dawn airport, the men on either side of Zuri moving her through a terminal like she was a problem to be relocated rather than a person to be seen. And now, 2 faces, legally documented, financially protected, named by their mother, seen. The financial audit of the undisclosed inheritance structure is ongoing. As of this report, it has identified assets across 4 jurisdictions and is expected to take between 12 and 18 months to fully resolve. The daughters are named as interested parties in that process. Yoon Jae-hyun's divorce was finalized 6 weeks after the agreement was signed. The settlement terms have not been made public. Seo Yoona gave a single interview to a Korean women's magazine 4 months later. She said one thing I thought was worth repeating. I was not the only woman in this story who deserved better. And Zuri? Last I heard, she had started working again. A small firm in Lisbon, a new project. Something of her own, built from the ground up in a city she had not chosen but had learned to call home. She hasn't spoken to the press since our interview. She doesn't need to. The document spoke. The record spoke. The daughters, growing, loud, present, legally undeniable, speak every day just by existing. I filed the final piece on this story on a Wednesday evening in October. My editor read it, made 3 small edits, and sent me a message that said, "This is the one." I think she was right. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. The thing I haven't been able to file away cleanly even now. The proposal that Yoon Jae-hyun brought to that conference room, the comprehensive, carefully structured, immediately actionable proposal, was not something that gets written in a single night by a newly hired legal team. The detail was too precise. The concessions were too specific. The language around the inheritance, in particular, was drafted with a knowledge of the internal documentation that suggested it had been in preparation for longer than one frantic overnight session. Which means someone inside Yoon Jae-hyun's world, someone with full access to his legal strategy and his private documents, had been preparing a clean exit long before I landed in Lisbon. Long before the article published. Long before the paralegal walked into that Seoul courtroom. Someone had seen this coming. Someone had been building the door for a while, and I don't know who that person is. Yet. I've covered this industry for 11 years. Powerful men, hidden lives, documents that were never supposed to see daylight. I've reported from 4 countries and sat across from sources who were genuinely afraid. But Yoon Jae-hyun's case keeps me up at night. And not for the reason you'd expect. Because someone inside that organization built the exit strategy before the walls came down. Someone protected those girls before they were even born. Someone knew exactly which documents to prepare, which concessions to pre-authorize, which legal language would hold under international scrutiny. That level of preparation doesn't come from panic. It comes from loyalty. Or from guilt. Or from something much more complicated than either. The daughters are safe. The record is public. The story, officially, is closed. But that question stays open in a way I can't explain away. So tell me, who do you think was building that exit door from the inside? And was Yoon Jae-hyun the man who ordered it built? Or the man who had no idea it existed until it was already the only way out?